Thank you for the invitation to speak with you again. We just seem to have lost our... We have a problem. Oh, it's good. All right, good. I thought maybe all the way from Australia it was feeling tired or something like this. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you again for the second time. Just to make a couple of other comments from yesterday, I've had a couple of other people since yesterday say to me about my name, McDonald, but I have to say I was pretty impressed with this group's response to the question that Gigi asked this morning about how many of you have, or how many are having McDonald's or McDonald's burger, and I couldn't believe it. There was only one person in the group that said that he has, and that it's been only once. So I take it from that that you are a group that really does live with what you believe. So very, very good. My second presentation is titled From Weet-Bix to Wellbeing, and it is to look at the Australian nutrition advocacy experience. So what I wanted to do is share with you some highlights of some experiences that we've had over the last couple of years, because not only do we want to help to serve our community with healthy foods and also healthy food services, but we also know that it's very important to influence the influencers with the sorts of nutrition and health messages that are getting to them. So just as a very quick refresher, Sanitarium's reason for being is not to make money, but rather it is with this philosophical purpose of genuinely caring for the health, hope and happiness of every person. And as I said yesterday, to promote the health of the whole person, body, mind, heart and spirit. So in essence, what we're wanting to do is to be true to our name, which is helping people to learn to stay well. And so as we quickly shared yesterday, Sanitarium has two areas that it works in, both foods and services, and both of them have a unique role to play in helping people. And our advocacy work actually covers both of these areas, although most of the examples that I'm going to share with you today come from the food side of things, because that's the area that is the oldest for us and the most area that we have experience in. So yesterday I talked about all of the areas in health and in wellbeing, and that was just to set an overview for all of the activities that we're involved in. But today in the second presentation, Dr. Dan has asked me to specifically talk about this nutrition advocacy area, and then tomorrow I'll come back and talk in more detail about some of the things that we talked about yesterday, the Sanctuary Health and Wellbeing Village, our Cultivate Workplace program, and also the CHIP program, not the McDonald's chips though, of course. Okay, so what is food and nutrition advocacy all about? Well, as we've been talking about over the last couple of days, there is a great body of evidence and a great body of science and knowledge that we as dietitians and other health professionals might have in our heads. But this has to be translated to people in the community, and so an important part of our role is not only being able to understand these things, but also to be able to communicate them and share with people in our communities to set up what will be a supportive environment for people to make healthy food choices within. So there are three key points. I don't know what's happened here. Yeah, okay, so we are, actually it looks like all of the slides, yeah, there's something not quite right there. I'm not sure if we could get another copy. I'll keep talking, but if we could get another copy, that would be good, because there are things on the presentation that I'll need you to see. Okay, so there are 3 points to the position that Sanitarium takes when it looks at nutrition and food advocacy work. And the first one is that we believe it's really important to have what we call a voice, and to be influencing the agenda for food policy and regulation in our country. And so this means not only having a point of view that we can share with people in the community, but it also relates to food legislation, particularly as it relates to food products and the labelling requirements that are there. Because if you think about, as was said the other day, some of the most important nutrition decisions are made when people are actually buying foods, and so we need to equip them well at that point of sale to be able to make good choices. So that's the first point. It's important to have a voice and to be part of what the agenda is for public health. Secondly, and this is probably the most important point, is we believe that food and nutrition advocacy should put at its core the best interests of the public. Now, there are some groups out there, I would say, that perhaps might put their own profit purpose as the core of what they're doing, but we believe that it is very important that the interests of the public are right at the core. And then thirdly, we also believe it's important to take a very holistic approach, so not just looking at food as perhaps we might otherwise do, but to consider not only personal health, but also population health and the health of, in fact, the planet. Because if you think about it, there's quite a big relationship between what we eat and also the foods that we choose to eat and how that can impact on the health of our planet. Thank you, Luke, for trying to help me. Okay, you ended up with a bit of a break after all. I'm sorry for this. I'm not sure what's happened. Okay, so I was just saying that the 3 points that relate to our position include it's important to have a voice, it's important to put the interests of the public genuinely at the heart of what is happening, and we also believe that it's important to take a very holistic approach to the way that we look at these things. So So our focus in this advocacy area to date has been to contribute to various policy legislation and review projects. And this has included the nutrient reference values, the Australian Dietary Guidelines, the nutrition information panels, and also food labelling. And then, as we were also saying, given that the science is one part of it, the communication is another. We've also been very involved in communicating that science through health professional symposia. We've run a couple of international nutrition congresses in Australia and also been involved in publishing scientific reviews, and I'll be able to share a specific example of those with you a little bit later. So what are some of the specifics that I'll share with you today? Well, first I just wanted to share some of the current issues that are happening in the landscape of Australia food and nutrition advocacy. And the 2 key projects that are running at the moment is, firstly, we are going through a process of the review of our dietary guidelines, and I'll be able to share with you about the role that the Dietitians Association of Australia played in that, because they played a very significant role. I think you'll be interested to hear of that. The second area that is happening for us is a review of the front of pack labelling, and this would apply to all of Australia's food products. Whatever is decided here will become mandatory for companies to include to help consumers to make healthy eating choices. And then, after talking about the general landscape in Australia, I will talk about some of the examples that Sanitarium is specifically involved in. So we'll come back to those. But let's start with the review of the dietary guidelines, just to set this scene in the Australian landscape. So the Australian Dietary Guidelines were originally published in 1982, so that's about 30 years ago. They're managed by a group there called the National Health and Medical Research Council, and this is a government body that is responsible for the development and the maintenance of public and individual health in Australia, and it's funded by the Australian Government's Department of Health and Ageing. Now, the Australian Dietary Guidelines are meant to be reviewed every 5 years. However, because the process usually takes a considerable amount of time, it's historically been more like every 10 years that they've been updated. So, for instance, the guidelines that we're reviewing now are the guidelines from 2001, and the process for this review started in 2006. So 7 years later, the review of these is still happening, and they say that good things take time, so hopefully the dietary guidelines that we have released will be good. So the current draft dietary guidelines were published for comment in December of last year, 2011. And so the National Health and Medical Research Council has been receiving submissions from various groups within the industry, and in fact I understand that they've had 219 submissions, and some of them can be quite thick. So you can imagine that group, that working party group, have a lot to wade through and to determine where they're going to have this land. And so we're expecting, because they're considering all of these things now, but we're expecting that the final guidelines will be released to the public in September of this year, so it will be very interesting to see what comes out. Now, just to share with you a bit about who is involved in the Nutrition Working Committee that actually sets these dietary guidelines. It's a specially selected working group that's made up of leaders in public health and nutrition from the government, also from academia, also from the public health perspective, and we have probably the best known dietitian in Australia. Her name is Rosemary Stanton, and she's very passionate about nutrition, but also the environmental side of what we eat as well, and she's represented on the group. We have a lot of non-government organisations that still represent health, such as the Cancer Council, and we also have the food industry involved, and they are represented by one person from the collective group of food industries, which is called the Australian Food and Grocery Council. So you can see that there are interests from a number of different areas that are involved in determining that. So what's the process that an initiative such as this goes through? Well, the first critical step has been to look at dietary modelling. So what, if we model certain types of diets, which ones are actually going to give the best nutrient values? And so the group have undertaken this work and have come up with what they call the core food groups, and then this was developed into a document to underpin the guidelines. So this is sort of the background work from which the guidelines will be developed, and this is what is pictured here on the slide. And that document is called Foundation and Total Diets, and it was based, as you can imagine, on a huge amount of systematic reviews of the science in the literature. So that was the first step. Now the second part of this is determining, taking all of that information from the scientific reviews and then the foundational document, and then comes the writing of what we call the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. Now this is the national nutrition education tool for, or it will be, for Australia, and it's what's used in schools and various other places to help people to understand what is good to eat. And we previously had a pyramid that showed what to eat most and then what to eat less of. But this time we've gone more towards the plate that is similar to what is used in the United States of America. Now, all of these elements that I've talked about, the systematic reviews, the development of the foundational document and the development of this Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, are actually put out to tender for people to oversee and coordinate and then report back to the governing body, which is the National Health and Medical Research Council. So this is where the role of the Dietitians Association of Australia comes in, because they played a very significant role. They were actually the organisation that was the successful tenderer to be able to digest all of the information and to develop the dietary guidelines, and in particular they were involved in publishing the papers that sit behind what the dietary guidelines are to become. So they were involved in a number of stages, as I said, the systematic literature review, but they also made formal submissions to the National Health and Medical Research Council themselves and directly represented their views to the review committee to clarify and really cement the position. So you can see that they had a very significant role. That's the first time in Australia that the Dietitians Association has been so involved in the development of the dietary guidelines, and I think it's obviously a very good and positive thing for the profession. Okay, so moving on to talk about the other key thing that's happening in the Australian food and policy agenda at the moment, and this is the area of front of pack labelling. So just to give a bit of background to this one, in 2009 our ministerial council, which is made up of the health ministers from each state in Australia and New Zealand, announced that there was going to be a comprehensive review of food labelling law and policy. And the review was undertaken again by a panel in public health, who were leaders in public health and in policy and also in the food industry. And what they did was they had 2 chances for public health comment and consultation, and they actively sought submissions from various groups in the development of the project. And then they released a report called Labelling Logic in January of 2001. So it's within this context that I wanted to share with you some of the specific activities that Sanitarium did to help with nutrition advocacy. So looking firstly at what we did around the Australian dietary guidelines, we had, I guess, a fairly similar view to what the Dietitians Association of Australia had, although we had a couple of differing points, and I wanted to share with you what those were, and we then obviously shared these points of view with the overseeing body as well. First and foremost, we felt that the guidelines needed to be more food-based than they actually were. People eat foods, as we've been discussing, not nutrients. And as Dr. Connell said on Tuesday, foods are the sources of nutrients. So people need to know what foods to choose to optimise health and well-being and to increase longevity. And if we just talk about nutrients, people may not necessarily know then what foods to choose. So that was one thing we thought was important. Secondly, we had wanted to see environmental sustainability included in the dietary guidelines. And thirdly, we wanted to see that the principles of social equity were important, so that people who had the lowest incomes or were disadvantaged from a financial perspective, the foods that were recommended would still be accessible for them. And these 3 principles are the tenets of what is called the new nutrition science, and I'll come back to this in a moment. So in addition, though, to those 3 principles, we also wanted to ensure that vegetarian diets weren't going to be marginalised in the development of this project. And the reason that I say that is that for a period of time, it was actually recommended and proposed that there would be one set of dietary guidelines for general nutrition, and then that there would be a separate set of guidelines for people who were vegetarian. Now, we were a little bit concerned with that because we felt that it would indicate that perhaps a vegetarian diet is quite separate and is not mainstream. And when you consider that it's true that there are only about 3% of the population in Australia that are vegetarian, but on the other hand, there's over 50% of people who say that they're wanting to eat less meat and who call themselves meat reducers. So it was important that the guidelines were mainstream and were applicable to everybody. Okay, so this new nutrition science, I'm just going to expand a little bit more about. Can I just get an indication, who's heard of this new nutrition science? A couple, okay. So I'll just share with it. It was a joint initiative of the International Union of Nutrition Sciences and the World Health Policy Forum. So the task related to this was initiated in the year 2001. At the time of the 17th International Congress on Nutrition that was held in Vienna. I was actually at that conference and so saw the very early stages of this being developed. And it's been progressed at many international meetings since that time. So then at a workshop that was held in April in 2005 in Germany, there was agreement sought on what the principles of this project would be, the definition and the dimensions of this project. And then there was proceedings and papers that were published at the same time as the 18th International Congress on Nutrition that was held in September 2005 in South Africa. And it was at that time that this new project was officially launched. And so really the aim of that project was to try and redefine nutrition. So it was to hang on to all of the things that we know as classical nutrition science issues, but also to meet the new challenges that relate to the environment and planetary health that are now much more relevant for us in this new century than perhaps they previously would have been. And the definition included 4 dimensions to health, not just the biological or the physical, but also social, environmental and economic, and obviously they are all really interconnected, so it's good to be looking at all of them. I'll just share with you the conclusion of that new nutrition science report. It says the new nutrition science is concerned with personal and population health and also with planetary health. The welfare and future of the whole physical and living world of which humans are a part. In this way, the discipline will make a greater contribution to the preservation, maintenance, development and sustenance of life on Earth, relevant for this 21st century. So interesting, isn't it? It takes a much more holistic approach. This slide with the pyramid shows a great encapsulation of those principles. So you can see there the biological, the social, the environmental and the economic, and how they are all quite interconnected. And it was this framework that Sanitarium used to make its presentations to the group reviewing the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So in addition to basing our submission on the principles from the new nutrition science project, we also made formal submissions through the process. We additionally met with each of the health ministers of each state government in Australia and New Zealand, which I think there was about 8 in total. So that's actually sitting down with the Minister of Health in each state and saying what we felt needed to be included in the guidelines. And in addition to that, we also met with many other public health groups because as has been the theme of a lot of what's being discussed, collaboration and partnerships, as we'll see, are a very important part of being effective and successful in these kinds of projects. So let's have a look at what the draft dietary guidelines are. You can see there's 5 of them. The first one is to eat a wide variety of nutritious foods from these 5 groups every day. And then it goes through and talks about vegetables and fruits, grain products, lean meats and the meat alternative group, and also the dairy and dairy alternative group. And then it talks about drinking water. Guideline 2 talks about limiting our intake of foods and drinks that contain saturated and trans fats and added salt, sugar and alcohol. Guideline 3 is about maintaining a healthy weight, so it's encouraging people to be physically active and to choose amounts of foods that can meet but not surpass their energy needs. And there is some special acknowledgement there given to children and adolescents and also to older people. And Guideline 4 is about breastfeeding, and Guideline 5 is about caring for our food so that when we eat it, it doesn't become contaminated and cause us to become sick in other ways. Now, we were pleased with pretty much the shape that these dietary guidelines took. We don't know whether some of the things that we had advocated for were included because of our efforts or whether they would have happened anyway, and this is the sort of thing you don't necessarily know in this kind of project. But there are a couple of things that we were a bit disappointed about, and so I just wanted to share a couple of those with you. As I'd said earlier, we were keen to see something on sustainability included, but as you would have just heard, there actually wasn't any guideline there on the link between what we eat and the health of the planet. This was interesting because in 2009, the National Health and Medical Research Council had actually indicated that they were going to include something about the sustainability of the right food choices in the dietary guidelines. So there has been some material included in the background papers, but it's not in the actual guidelines that consumers and the general public would be reading, which is interesting. I just wanted to share this quote with you. It comes from the Health Council of the Netherlands advisory report for their guidelines, and it's interesting because they say a healthy diet is generally an ecologically sustainable one, and so you can flip that around and you can say an ecologically sustainable diet is also generally a healthy diet. So there is a lot of synergy between those two areas. And so we were disappointed that this wasn't included, but we will continue to advocate that this is something that's included in future guidelines. One of the other points that we felt wasn't quite as it could be was we felt that the recommendations as they related to legumes could have been strengthened because of the very significant amount of research behind the health benefits of legumes. And I understand from talking with Professor Mark Volquist, who was the previous president of the International Union of Nutrition Sciences, through some research that he'd done, where they looked at all of the different foods that are available and they looked at which one was actually the strongest at reducing disease and increasing health. And I guess you can guess what it might be given what I've already said, but it was actually in fact legumes. So I agree with Gigi that there are no superfoods really, but there are certain foods, and legumes are certainly one of them, that can really give us powerhouses of nutrients and therefore protect us from disease and promote well-being. So, yeah, we felt that legumes could have been a little bit more prioritised. At least they're there in the vegetable group, and they are mentioned again in the lean meat group. But as I'll share with you on the next slide, you'll see that in some of the guidelines and advice from other countries, legumes are actually oftentimes presented up front as examples of healthy protein. So let's just have a look at some of those. So from the Harvard University, their advice is when you're choosing healthy protein, choose fish, poultry, beans and nuts, limit red meat, avoid bacon, cold cuts and other processed meats. So it's put legumes right towards the front. The Health Canada group, under the meat and alternatives group, they say have meat alternatives such as beans, lentils and tofu often. It was great to hear that you have tofu here in Romania. Eat at least 2 food guide servings of fish each week. Select lean meat and alternatives prepared with little or no added fat or salt. So interesting, isn't it? And then the USDA, vary your protein food choices. Twice a week, make seafood the protein on your plate. Eat beans, which are a natural source of fibre and protein. Keep meat and poultry portions small and lean. So we felt that Australia was a bit behind. They'd left legumes down the end of the list, whereas we thought that it would be beneficial and give a better message if legumes were at the front, towards the front of the list. We, as I said before, felt that particularly guideline 2 could have been more food-based. When we tell people that they need to limit their intake of foods containing saturated fats and trans fats, it's not very obvious for people necessarily what those foods are. So that pretty much covers the project that we've been involved in relation to the dietary guidelines, and it certainly will be interesting to see if there are any changes, further changes to these draft guidelines when they're released in September of next year. Now, I wanted to share this with you. As we were working on the dietary guidelines submissions and we met with a number of different groups, it was clear that the Public Health Association of Australia had very similar views to what we did. And I'm just sharing this example with you because it shows what can be done through collaboration and partnership as opposed to just working by yourself. So we partnered with this Public Health Association of Australia group, and we convened a round table event for a lot of public health stakeholders, and had academics, opinion leaders, dietitians, and the food industry consider how this new nutrition science could be applied to public health recommendations in Australia and also to the Australian dietary guidelines. And so the outcomes of this round table, which was held in 2008, were encaptured into an advocacy report, which we released in 2009, and it's called A Future for Food. And then this document we then also sent out to all of the health ministers, and when we met with them, it was very clear that there was a number of groups within public health within Australia that had similar views. And I've got if anyone's interested, I've got a couple of copies here with me of these. Okay, so what was the key intent of this document? Well, it was a call to action to the National Health and Medical Research Council, where we were encouraging them to address the issue of overnutrition and overconsumption, that we were encouraging the diversity of diet with emphasis on foods, all of the plant foods in particular that have been shown to be disease protective. To put foods first, again, as opposed to nutrients, and to discourage foods and eating styles that contribute to the burden of disease. And as we've also mentioned, to incorporate environmental impact of our food choices and to consider social inequalities in our society as these guidelines were being developed. Now that report has just fairly recently been updated. We released a version 2, A Future for Food 2, that was released in February of this year, and this actually takes things a step on again. In Australia, we don't have a minister at the federal level that looks after food itself. And so we were, in partnership with the Public Health Association of Australia, were calling, as the quote says here, for the federal government to take responsibility and to be accountable for creating a healthy, sustainable and fair food system, starting with the creation of a ministerial portfolio for food headed by a cabinet minister. Now that hasn't we haven't seen any specific outcome of that at this point, but laying a lot of foundation work is how these things go and can take quite a bit of time. Okay, so we'll move on now to talk about Sanitarium's involvement in the front of pack labelling project because Sanitarium had a very strong view on what was being recommended at that point in time. So through the consultation process, it became obvious that there were really two options that were being considered. Now, I should just say that this front of pack labelling system is, if I can just show you this pack here, and this is definitely not meant to be an advertisement, it was just the only food packet that I had handy at the time. But what the government is looking to do is to implement on the front of the pack an easy guide for people to help them to make healthy eating choices. Because we do already, of course, have a nutrition information panel on the side of the pack that goes into detail along with the ingredient list. But the overwhelming response from consumers is that they don't know how to interpret this. So what they want that detail on the side, but they want something that helps them interpret whether that product is a good choice or not. So that's what I'm talking about with this food front of pack labelling project. Okay, so as I started to say, it became clear that there were two options that the government may choose, and I'll just first talk about the first one, and then we'll talk about the second one. The first one is actually inspired by what the European-style traffic light system uses. And it looks at total fat, at saturated fat, at sugar, and at salt. So, as most of you would no doubt be aware, this traffic light system rates nutrients in a given food as either being, too high, and it will get a red traffic light. If it's medium, it will get the yellow or the amber light. And if it's low and it's good, then it will get a green traffic light according to agreed threshold levels. So it has its benefits. It's simple, it's visual, and it is considered globally to be one of the best interpretive nutrition. One of the most interpretive ones that's available globally. However, Sanitarium, I guess, had a concern that it mainly looks at what we call negative nutrients. It tells you what you're trying to be avoiding, but it doesn't help you distinguish for what are the good things, the positive nutrients that you're actually looking for. Now, if I can try and bring this to life through an example, you may have, let's consider something like sultanas versus jelly beans. Now, both of those products, if they were putting something like this on the front, could get a red for sugar. But does that seem fair to you? Why? Exactly right. So with, let's say, the sultanas, not only is it's naturally occurring sugar, but it's coming packaged with a lot of other vitamins and minerals and antioxidants and fibre, whereas the jelly beans are just delivering a refined added sugar without all of those things. So we felt that was a bit unfair. It didn't really help to distinguish between sugar, the type of sugar content, and also the type of fat content. It's covered a little through fat versus saturated fat, but it doesn't, we didn't think, do it as well as what it could. And so we felt that there was missed opportunities for helping to interpret nutrition for consumers. Now, the second system that was being considered at that time is called the Daily Intake Guide. And this particular system was preferred by the food industry. And it shows the contribution of a serve of a food product as a percentage of the average daily requirement for that. So it talks about how much energy or how much fat a food will give you as a percentage. Now, does that seem like an easily interpretable thing? I'm a dietitian, and I don't feel that I have good access to information with this system, and so we were not very keen on it. But there were a number of other food industry groups that were very keen on it because it just really muddied the waters. It was actually not interpretive, and of course, a lot of food manufacturers don't want to have a lot of red on their products. So the other one didn't suit them really at all. And so from Sanitarium's perspective, we felt that perhaps there was another way of doing this. And so we developed our own front-of-pack labelling system to try and address some of the issues. Now, this is a little bit different because it rates the positive aspects of a particular food product. So it talks about protein and fibre, and it also talks about whole food content. This is very unique. It hasn't actually been done, to our knowledge, anywhere else in the world. So it emphasises and it puts a weighting on the benefits of whole foods such as fruits and vegetables, grains and legumes, nuts and seeds. It, like the traffic light system, it still talks about what nutrients we need to be, or what considerations we need to be careful with, such as saturated fat and added sugar and salt. And so we felt that this was genuinely more interpretive and could help people to make better choices. And you can see that overall it will give advice on whether this is a food that dietitians and nutritionists would recommend to be eat often, or eat occasionally, or eat sparingly. And again, this hadn't been done anywhere else in the world. So we wanted to check of these, because there's 3 options now, which did consumers feel was actually the most helpful to them. So we did some research through an independent research group called Newspoll, and we asked people to look at the 3 different methods, and you can see that the response there was a definite preference towards the healthy eating system. So we were very encouraged by that, and we shared the results from these findings into a document called the front of pack labelling, which traffic lights. So we were keen for the traffic light option, but we wanted to expand it a little bit further, and we shared that with health ministers, and we also launched it to the media, who really picked up on this concept. And the exciting thing was that the group overseeing this have decided that perhaps there does need to be another way of doing things. Now, just to be clear, we didn't want to say that it had to be Sanitarium's way of doing it. We didn't want people to feel pressured by a food company. So what we recommended was to take that sort of approach, and perhaps there was another way of doing it. So this was the recommendation, that the uptake of an integrated approach to front of pack labelling and its widespread use on foods would speak loudly about the ability and willingness of food suppliers and regulators and health advocacy groups and other stakeholders to help resolve the growing burden of chronic disease in Australia and New Zealand. And so as a result all of this, we had public health organisations coming to us and advocating this new traffic light system. And you can see here that the Cancer Council, the Diabetes Group in Victoria, and a number of other groups all got in behind and were supporting this potentially new way of doing front of pack labelling. And so the government are considering that at this point in time. They've set up a working group to try and say, okay, we think that what you've come up with here, Sanitarium, is probably the way to go, but we'll put a working group onto this and just be very sure that we think this is the right thing to apply across Australia and New Zealand. And the exciting thing from that was that they actually asked the doctor who had been involved in doing this work within Sanitarium to sit on their working group. So that was an exciting outcome that clearly wouldn't have happened if we hadn't undertaken all of this work. Okay, just a couple of other things to share with you. I thought you might be interested to hear, even in the development of something like this plate, the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes that most people don't necessarily know about. And I can share with you one example. We have a very, very active meat and livestock corporation in Australia and New Zealand, and they have a large group of dietitians and advocate health professionals that are very keen for meat to be seen as so very important. And I think, in fact, that if they could have their way, they would probably put meat at the very centre of the plate and the other things around. But you can see up towards the, say, between 11 and 12 o'clock, that section of the plate up there, that's our meat and meat alternatives group. And in that is sitting red meat, fish, chicken, eggs, legumes, nuts and seeds. Now, the Meat and Livestock Corporation were advocating for some changes here, and they were advocating that the nuts would be taken out of this section and put into where the oils sit, which is right outside of the plate. They were advocating that the legumes and the seeds would go into the vegetables group, and they were advocating that eggs would go somewhere else as well. So what did that leave in that section? Just meat. So what sort of message would that give people in the community? What would you say? That meat is essential. It's one of the 5 food groups, and there was no alternatives. So fortunately, there was a fair bit of pushback to this advocacy work that they had done, and we're very pleased that there is a meat and meat alternatives section has been included and retained in the plate. I thought I'd just show you a couple of examples of the communications that Meat and Livestock Group were using to advocate for their position. This one was actually appeared in a medical journal and a medical magazine for doctors. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. And it has the title Red Meat, Nutritional Alternatives Don't Grow on Trees. So it makes the very strong inference that you can't meet your nutritional requirements unless you're eating meat. And it actually says here, a recent study found that substituting red meat with plant-based alternatives may compromise the fulfilment of key nutrient requirements. And then in the table below, even though you can't see that, it compares red meat with lentils and nuts and seeds and their ability to give us iron and zinc and various other things, which they say meat has the superior nutrition content. Now, this is interesting because that's one part of the picture, but when you look at all of the research, while it's true that plant foods may have less iron in what we actually eat, we know when it comes to actually health outcomes that there is no higher incidence of iron deficiency anemia in vegetarians than there is in the general population. And I'm sure, as you know, that's because vegetarians are more likely to absorb more iron because they're eating more vitamin C, which helps with the absorption of that. So it's an interesting one that shows where this can become very cloudy and there can be a lot of misinformation for not only people in the community but also health professionals that then pass this information on to the community as well. I'll just show you another one here. This is again in a doctor's journal, an article, and it's positioned as a prescription, and it says down the bottom, red meat, we were meant to eat it. So this message of its essentiality is very, very strong. These next two that I'm going to show you are actually in consumer magazines, women's magazines, ads on TV, etc., where this message of red meat, we were meant to eat it, keeps coming through time and time again. So as a result of this, we find that when we come, because you'll recall me saying that we really want to promote the benefits of plant-based eating as giving optimal health outcomes, but we found that one of the most significant issues that we faced when we were doing that was that people had in their perception that not having meat or not having enough meat might compromise their nutrition intake. And so we felt that it was very important to help set the record straight on that, and to look very carefully at the scientific literature and have some papers published that would help to dispel these myths and to share the real science on the topic. And so we have a senior dietitian at Sanitarium. Her name is Angela Saunders, and in fact she's a very good friend of Dr. Connell's. And she headed up a project where she recruited or worked with a number of other dietitians. They weren't just within Sanitarium, in fact most of them were outside of Sanitarium, to undertake a proper literature review of the adequacy of a vegetarian diet. And so the aim was to publish a series of peer-reviewed papers on the nutrients important in a plant-based diet that will enable health practitioners to feel more confident in recommending plant-based eating to their clients. Okay, so this is just showing the areas of nutrition that were being looked at. The group reviewed hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers. I think, in actual fact, it took something like about 4 to 5 years for all of the work that happened in this area. And so the result of this was a supplement. And again, I have extra copies of this if anyone would like a copy. A supplement that was published with the Medical Journal of Australia that looks at the adequacy of a vegetarian diet and shows that it is possible to definitely get not only all of the nutrients that you need, but in fact extra that can help with well-being and quality of life. Okay, so we then also took the findings of this to the media, and actually just about a week before leaving for here, I attended a media event where we launched the results of this to the media, and we were absolutely delighted with the uptake and the interest in the media of this topic. We had over 80 media hits that included 4 on national television, and you can see the others there as well. And I just thought I'd share with you some of the newspaper articles. Plant-based diet is a healthy choice. And it says a meat-free lifestyle may not be risky as once thought. And so it's just unpacking that extra information there. No dangers in a vegetarian diet. It says down the bottom under the picture, traditional concerns about not eating meat have been dispelled by new research, and vegetarians are well fed. So this is not necessarily about trying to say everyone has to be a vegetarian, but it's just saying that it's not necessary to have meat or large amounts of meat to be healthy. Okay, so let's summarise, because it must be well and truly lunchtime by now. So I've just touched on a few of the advocacy projects that Sanitarium's been involved in. I could tell you many, many others that I've personally been involved in as well over the last 10 years, but just to recap on some of the key points before we finish up. The first one is, remember it's important to have a voice and to make a contribution to this area. If we stay silent, then there are only other voices that will be heard. The second key thing is, and I can't emphasise this enough, the public health interests must be prioritised ahead of any food industry interests. The third part is that this sort of work takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment from a time perspective and over a long period of time. We may not necessarily see results the next day, but it's about changing people's paradigms, and so these things take time. The fourth thing to say is efforts are much more likely to be effective when we work with other groups, when we collaborate and we partner, rather than working alone. And then the last thing to say is using the media effectively, releasing information to the media can be very helpful in gaining the attention of key stakeholders. Because if you think of politicians and ministers in the government, what is important for them is what their constituency think and what their constituency want. So we've been able to change a number of things within Australia by saying this is what the community are looking for. So keep that in mind. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of some of the projects and initiatives that happen in the area of public health and nutrition, and also further highlights for you some of the work opportunities for dietitians in this area. And there's a couple of quotes that I'd just like to finish with that I think really summarise the importance of advocacy work. So we'll just look at those. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. The second one I really like. We must become the change we wish to create. This means that we need to walk the talk because people can tell if you're being genuine, and people are watching to see whether it is something that you genuinely believe. And then the last two I think are great. Politics should be the part-time job of every citizen. And I thought you might like this one. An enlightened citizen is an indispensable ingredient of the infrastructure of democracy. So as dietitians, I think we can play a very powerful role as enlightened citizens. So I thank you very much for your time, and we'll enjoy lunch together. Thank you.